The accepted history of the Battle of Balaclava, etched into the collective consciousness through poetry and political theatre, is a profound and deliberate obfuscation. It is a narrative of reckless gallantry and tragic futility, the infamous charge of the Light Brigade, a spectacular failure that, by its very nature, served a useful purpose for the political class in London. For in the dazzling, self-immolating heroism of the Light Brigade, the true, deeply inconvenient tactical miracle that secured the British position was effectively buried. This documentary, however, refuses the easy, romantic lie. We must turn our gaze away from the spectacle of the North Valley and fix it firmly upon the South, where a contingent of less than 600 men, facing impossible odds, executed a maneuver born not of folly, but of hard-won, pragmatic genius. The traditional narrative presents Balaclava as a study in Allied incompetence, a testament to the fatal arrogance of the aristocratic military command. While much of this assessment is demonstrably true, the sheer logistical dereliction, the political appointments that elevated the dangerously unfit to command, the catastrophic mismanagement of the supply lines, it fails utterly to account for the astonishing tactical success achieved by the 93rd, Sutherland, Highlanders under the command of Sir Colin Campbell. Their defence of the vital supply port of Balaclava against an overwhelming force of some 3,000 Russian cavalry was not merely an act of bravery. It was a watershed moment in military history, a violent, undeniable demonstration that the age of massed cavalry dominance had been violently concluded by the industrial realities of modern warfare and the disciplined application of new doctrine. The political imperative to diminish this victory was immediate and overwhelming. Campbell, a veteran professional, forged in the heat of India and the dusty pragmatism of decades of combat, was an institutional outsider. His success did not reflect well upon the High Command, whose failures had precipitated the crisis. To praise the disciplined, unorthodox victory of the Thin Red Line was to condemn the systemic incompetence of the British establishment that had exposed them in the first place. It was far simpler, and politically safer, to celebrate a glorious tragedy, a mistake that could be framed as a noble sacrifice, than to scrutinize a successful tactical deployment that spoke volumes about the inadequacy of the appointed aristocratic commanders. The poet Tennyson, dispatched to immortalize the battle, ensured the charge of the Light Brigade became the immutable cornerstone of the Crimean legend, while Campbell's brilliance was relegated to a marginal footnote, a minor engagement quickly summarized and filed away. This revisionist account demands we ask not what happened, but why it was forgotten. The answers lie not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power, the deep corruption in Whitehall, the catastrophic structural failures of the commissariat, and the sheer political will to maintain an antiquated class structure atop the armed forces, regardless of the human cost. The political treachery began long before the first shot was fired, in the diplomatic and economic machinations that dragged Britain into a conflict over the crumbling Ottoman Empire, framed as a crusade but rooted in calculated geopolitical risk. We must understand the war's true genesis, the systemic rot that made the logistical collapse inevitable, to truly grasp the impossible odds faced by Campbell and his men. Their victory, quiet and deeply technical, was a sharp rebuke to the entire system, a rebuke the system could not, and would not, allow to stand unchallenged in the historical record. We begin our inquiry not with the infantry, but with the men who signed the fatal orders thousands of miles away. The historical spotlight often lingers on the heroic tragedy of the battlefield, but the true architect of the Crimean catastrophe was not the Russian Tsar nor any Allied general. It was a profound and systemic failure of statecraft, rooted in the political and administrative rot that characterized mid-Victorian Whitehall. The war, which positioned the 93rd Highlanders in their desperate stand, was not a righteous crusade, but the inevitable consequence of a series of calculated risks, cynical maneuvering, and spectacular diplomatic blunders driven by economic paranoia and social rigidity. The central, metastasizing ailment was the Eastern question, the political and economic void created by the protracted, seemingly irreversible decay of the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. The vacuum of power threatened the precarious balance established by the Congress of Vienna. For Britain, the primary fear was not spiritual or humanitarian, but economic. the security of the trade routes to India and, critically, the prevention of Russian control over the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. If the Russian Black Sea Fleet gained unfettered access to the Mediterranean, the balance of naval power, the bedrock of the British Empire's global dominance, would be irrevocably shattered. This was a war fought over strategic choke points, not moral high ground. The political environment in London was defined by a profound disconnect between the ruling class and the operational realities of modern conflict. The Foreign Office, under the mercurial control of figures like Lord Palmerston, pursued a policy of aggressive containment of Russia with a swaggering indifference to the logistical capabilities of the military establishment. The prevailing political culture favored aristocratic privilege over professional competence. Senior military appointments were not based on merit but on social standing, political favors, and a rigid adherence to outdated doctrine. This institutionalized incompetence, the rotten heart of Whitehall, ensured that even a limited expeditionary force was destined for logistical collapse. The critical diplomatic failure lies in the period immediately preceding the declaration of war. Russia's actions, however aggressive, particularly the occupation of the Danubian principalities, were met with a British diplomatic response that was both provocative and indecisive. Palmerston's aggressive posturing and the ill-conceived joint Anglo-French naval deployment were intended to intimidate, but they were not coupled with a credible commitment to war preparedness. The result was a dangerous diplomatic bluff that Tsar Nicholas I ultimately called. The war was, in essence, an avoidable conflict driven by an overestimation of British diplomatic leverage and a catastrophic underestimation of the logistical challenge. The financial elite in the City of London, deeply invested in Ottoman integrity and nervous about Russian expansionism, exerted considerable pressure on Parliament, framing the conflict in terms of national honor and free trade. This confluence of aristocratic incompetence, economic paranoia, and diplomatic failure provided the precise conditions for the resulting disaster. The systemic corruption was most glaring in the logistical chain. The commissariat, responsible for supplies, was a labyrinth of political patronage and outright fraud. Contracts for uniforms, food, and transport were awarded not to the most capable suppliers but to those with the deepest political connections, resulting in shoddy goods, exorbitant costs, and chronic shortages. This entrenched system of administrative decay meant that when the military expedition finally reached the Crimea, the subsequent starvation, disease, and shortage of basic necessities were not misfortunes of war, but the predetermined outcome of political negligence. When the British forces were finally committed to the Black Sea, they were, by administrative design, positioned for failure. The systemic rot in the government offices created the impossible odds that Sir Colin Campbell would ultimately confront. The tragedy of the 93rd Highlanders was not just the fight they faced against the Russian cavalry. It was the fact that their immediate enemy, the lack of support, intelligence, and basic supplies, was manufactured not in St. Petersburg, but in the careless, self-serving chambers of Westminster. The field of Balaclava would become the ultimate physical manifestation of Whitehall's geopolitical conceit. The journey from the comfortable drawing rooms of Whitehall to the exposed, frozen slopes of the Crimean Peninsula was, for the British Army, a relentless series of logistical blunders, culminating in a systemic failure that dwarfed the political incompetence preceding it. By the time Sir Colin Campbell and his Highlanders were placed on the defensive at Balaclava, their immediate enemy was not yet the Russian cavalry, but the utter dereliction of their own supply chain. This scarcity, the intentional lack of provisioning due to corruption and administrative arrogance, is the precise context that elevated the odds against them from difficult to impossible. The foundation of this catastrophe was the commissariat, the administrative body tasked with supplying the army. Far from being a professional, disciplined service, it was a repository of political patronage. Key positions were filled by individuals whose primary qualifications were their connections to powerful figures in London, not their experience in complex field logistics. The result was a bureaucracy defined by inefficiency, fraud, and a profound disinterest in the welfare of the common soldier. Contracts for essential supplies, food, fodder, clothing, and transport were awarded based on kickbacks and influence, leading to a system where the cheapest, shoddiest goods were routinely delivered at maximum cost. The landing at the Crimea following the Battle of the Alma exposed this rut to the harsh reality of war. There was no coherent plan for disembarking supplies, establishing forward depots, or ensuring the continuity of rations. Critical supplies remained floating offshore, or were hastily dumped onto beaches without adequate transport or inventory control. The single, most damaging failure, and the one that directly contributed to the vulnerability of the Balaclava position, was the lack of reliable transport. The necessary requisition of horses, mules, and wagons, a fundamental requirement for any army operating away from its naval base, was either ignored or executed with staggering incompetence. The few transport animals that were procured were often ill-suited to the task, poorly fed, and rapidly succumbed to neglect. This negligence created a fatal vulnerability: the dependence of the entire army, besieging Sevastopol, on the narrow, congested port of Balaclava. The harbor became a choked, chaotic mess, a vast, disorganized repository of uninventoried stores. Without sufficient transport animals or proper roads, a crucial 4-mile gap existed between the supplies at the port and the troops on the heights. The army, nominally within sight of its own provisions, was starving, freezing, and succumbing to preventable diseases, simply because the commissariat could not move the necessary goods. This systemic logistical paralysis had two critical, immediate consequences for the ensuing battle. Firstly, it compelled the High Command to keep their supply base dangerously close to the enemy, in a position that was strategically exposed. The need to protect Balaclava became paramount, an anchor that dictated every defensive posture. Secondly, it drastically reduced the fighting efficiency of the troops. The 93rd Highlanders, like all British forces, were underfed, exhausted, and battling illness induced by inadequate clothing and exposure. Their physical condition, a direct result of the logistical failure, meant that their reserves of endurance were drastically low when the moment of supreme effort arrived. The construction of the only railway line, which would eventually mitigate this crisis, was delayed for months by bureaucratic infighting and a profound institutional arrogance that dismissed the necessity of such engineering efforts. In the weeks leading up to the Russian assault on Balaclava, the system was not merely struggling, it was in a state of terminal collapse. Soldiers froze in their summer uniforms, horses starved because their fodder was rotting on the quay, and the wounded suffered needlessly due to the absence of organized medical supplies. The context of the Thin Red Line must therefore be understood not as a glorious moment that occurred despite the failures of the state, but as a desperate, last-gasp survival effort caused by them. The 550 Highlanders were deployed in that dangerously thin formation not because of an abundance of force, but because the systemic corruption in Whitehall had ensured they had almost no one else to stand beside them. Their success was not just a tactical victory over the Russians, it was a profound moral victory over the catastrophic administrative betrayal they had endured. The immediate tactical vulnerability of the Balaclava position, the single most critical link in the British supply chain, was not an oversight, it was the direct, almost inevitable, consequence of the High Command's systemic failures and political cowardice. The true burden of command fell squarely upon Sir Colin Campbell, who was isolated not just geographically, but institutionally, by a leadership that actively distanced itself from the defensive line it had carelessly allowed to be established. The grand strategy of the British command, led by Lord Raglan, was obsessively focused on the siege of Sevastopol. This tunnel vision led to a profound strategic neglect of the rear, the vital logistics base at Balaclava. The assumption, rooted in a fatal blend of arrogance and poor intelligence, was that the Russians would not dare to launch a serious counteroffensive against the Allied flank. This hubris meant that adequate forces, sufficient fortifications, and clear, executable defensive orders were simply never provided for Balaclava. Campbell, as the officer tasked with securing the port, was placed in an impossible strategic dilemma. He commanded a meager, hastily assembled garrison, a patchwork of the 93rd Highlanders, a few companies of Royal Marines, and some understrength Turkish battalions, to guard a perimeter far too extensive for their numbers. He recognized immediately that the causeway heights, the low ridge protecting the valley that led directly to the harbor, were the crucial, defensible ground. Yet, the forces allocated to this ridge were criminally inadequate, and the Turkish battalions, though brave, were poorly equipped, lacked artillery support, and were entirely unsupported by the main Allied army positioned miles away on the plateau. The institutional failure lay in the fact that Raglan and his senior staff maintained a deliberate cordon sanitaire around the defensive problem at Balaclava. Any serious allocation of resources to secure the port would have meant drawing troops away from the glamour and perceived strategic importance of the Sevastopol siege. To admit the necessity of a robust defense of the rear would be to admit that the overall strategic plan, which had led them so far inland, was fundamentally flawed. Therefore, the problem was conveniently delegated, minimizing the political exposure of the central command should the line break. Campbell was, in effect, set up as the scapegoat of the vanguard. If Balaclava fell, the blame could be easily shifted to the officer commanding the isolated perimeter. If it held, the success could be vaguely attributed to the overall strategic genius of the commander-in-chief. This political calculation had tangible, tactical consequences. Campbell's requests for additional troops and field artillery were often delayed, minimized, or simply ignored. He was compelled to adopt a defensive posture that maximized the deployment of his few regulars, a posture born of tactical necessity, not choice. The decision to place the Highlanders in the key sector, effectively constituting the final, desperate barrier, reflected Campbell's understanding that his entire mission hinged on the discipline and firepower of that single regiment. He knew that if the Turkish lines on the causeway heights were broken, a high probability given their exposure, the defense of Balaclava would rest solely on the fragile line he could muster with the 93rd. The intelligence failures compounding this burden were staggering. Warnings of a major Russian counteroffensive were either dismissed as exaggeration or incompetently managed. The Russian commander, Prince Menshikov, correctly identified Balaclava as the primary British weakness and planned his assault, the only logical countermove, accordingly. Raglan's headquarters, paralyzed by overconfidence and a lack of effective reconnaissance, failed to provide Campbell with timely or accurate information regarding the massing of the Russian forces. Therefore, when the Russian columns finally descended upon the causeway heights in the early hours of October 25, 1854, the situation was precisely what Campbell had feared and predicted. The Turkish lines were quickly overwhelmed, and the path to Balaclava lay open. The 93rd Highlanders were placed in a position of absolute, mortal responsibility not by the fortunes of war, but by the cold, calculating indifference and strategic dereliction of their own high command. This historical context, the sheer weight of institutional betrayal and the deliberate isolation of Campbell, is essential to understanding the true scale of the impossible stand that was about to unfold. The defense of Balaclava, the tactical triumph that would briefly obscure the systemic failures of the Crimean campaign, was the direct product of one man's unconventional genius, Sir Colin Campbell. To understand the doctrine he employed, the audacity of the two-deep line, one must first understand the crucible of experience that forged him, a background utterly dissimilar to the aristocratic lineage that dominated the British military command. Campbell was the antithesis of the Horse Guards establishment, a professional soldier whose rank was earned in blood and strategy, not by purchase or patronage. Born in Glasgow in 1792, Campbell entered the army at the age of 16, beginning a career trajectory that would span over 5 decades of almost continuous active service, primarily in the colonial periphery, the very frontiers of the empire that the London elite often discounted. Crucially, his service was defined by his formative experiences in the Peninsular War under Wellington and later, more pivotally, in the ceaseless, grueling campaigns in India, often against the disciplined and technologically advanced forces of the various Sikh and Maratha states. These sepoy wars were Campbell's true military academy. In India, Campbell learned the hard, empirical lessons that the European-centric command structure in Whitehall steadfastly ignored. He faced disciplined, determined, and often numerically superior foes who utilized terrain and innovation effectively. This environment demanded pragmatism over parade ground rigidity. Where European doctrine clung to the 4-deep line and the solid column for shock value, Campbell learned the necessity of firepower density and the tactical flexibility required to survive asymmetrical engagements. His victories were based not on grand, predictable charges, but on maximizing the sustained output of his infantry and the disciplined control of their fire. He was a meticulous student of his craft. While his aristocratic counterparts engaged in fox hunting and political maneuvering, Campbell was preoccupied with logistics, terrain analysis, and the specific capabilities of his men and their weaponry. He instinctively understood that the emerging rifle technology, specifically the Minié rifle being introduced in the 1850s, rendered massed formations obsolete. The increased range, accuracy, and killing power of the new rifled weapons meant that traditional formations, designed to survive the inaccuracies of the smoothbore muskets, now merely presented larger, more inviting targets for wholesale slaughter. This deep-seated, pragmatic expertise bred an inherent institutional resistance to Campbell. His commitment to efficiency and his blunt, professional disdain for incompetence made him deeply unpopular with the aristocratic, amateurish high command. He was seen as a disruptive outsider, a man who succeeded because he ignored the prescribed, archaic conventions of military fashion. His promotions were often grudgingly granted and his counsel frequently overlooked, solely because he lacked the necessary political pedigree. His doctrine was simple, direct, and ruthlessly effective: discipline, sustained fire, and calculated risk. He emphasized marksmanship and precise drill, ensuring that every volley counted. This contrasted sharply with the prevailing British doctrine, which often relied on aggressive bayonet charges to break the enemy after one or two volleys. Campbell preferred to let the enemy come to him, to destroy their morale and cohesion with precise, overwhelming firepower delivered at the most psychologically damaging range. The posting to the Crimea, initially, was a chance for him to serve, but it placed him directly under the command of generals who operated on assumptions that had been proven fatally wrong in India years earlier. He arrived with a complete understanding of the obsolescence of the enemy's favored tactic, the massed cavalry charge, and the revolutionary potential of his regiment's rifles. This understanding, born of his years as the forgotten genius on the imperial periphery, was the intellectual framework that allowed him to make the decisive, counterintuitive decision at Balaclava. When faced with the logistical catastrophe and the overwhelming numbers of the Russian cavalry, Campbell had the conviction, earned over decades, to trust his own, unorthodox doctrine rather than the failed conventions of his superiors. The defensive formation adopted by the 93rd Highlanders at Balaclava, the thin red line, was not a spontaneous act of improvisation, but the ultimate expression of a century-long doctrinal struggle accelerated by technological change. To grasp the genius of Sir Colin Campbell's command, one must first analyze the fundamental shift occurring in the very arithmetic of infantry warfare, moving from the age of Marlborough's volley to the dawn of the rifle revolution. For over 150 years, the operational doctrine of European infantry was predicated upon the limitations of the smoothbore flintlock musket, specifically the iconic Brown Bess. This weapon was heavy, slow to reload, unreliable in damp conditions, and catastrophically inaccurate. Its effective range was rarely more than 80 to 100 yards, and its trajectory was so unreliable that true marksmanship was impossible. Consequently, military doctrine developed around maximizing psychological shock and volley volume rather than precision. The standard formation evolved into the four-deep line or the dense column. The four-deep line provided sufficient depth to ensure a sustained rate of fire. The front two ranks fired, while the rear two ranks prepared to move forward or reload. More critically, the depth provided the necessary physical and psychological cohesion to withstand the shock of a cavalry charge or a bayonet assault. It was a formation designed to compensate for the musket's lack of lethality by presenting a wall of bayonets and a devastating, yet highly inaccurate, volume of lead at close range. The objective was to make enough noise and throw enough lead to panic the enemy before they closed. However, by the 1850s, this established doctrine was being rendered obsolete by two critical technological leaps. First, the widespread adoption of percussion caps replaced the unreliable flintlock ignition system, allowing for far greater reliability and speed of fire, particularly in adverse weather. Second, and far more revolutionary, was the introduction of the Minié rifle and ball. The Minié ball was a conical, hollow-based projectile that expanded upon firing, engaging the rifling grooves cut into the barrel. This simple yet profound innovation transformed the infantry weapon. Suddenly, accuracy was extended from 100 yards to 300, 400, or even 600 yards, and the projectile retained its lethality over that greater distance. The smoothbore musket required mass troops to achieve a kill probability. The Minié rifle granted that same probability to the individual soldier. The High Command in Britain, dominated by conservative, aristocratic generals who had trained their entire lives under the old paradigm, resisted this shift furiously. They viewed the meticulous training required for rifle fire as excessive and unnecessary, preferring to rely on the discipline of the mass charge. They failed to grasp the simple, brutal geometry of the new warfare. A massed column, which was once a defensive necessity, was now nothing more than a dense target, guaranteed to suffer maximum casualties from the new precision weapons. Sir Colin Campbell, rooted in his pragmatic colonial experience and his keen eye for efficiency, understood this shift perfectly. He recognized that the 4-deep line was now an extravagance. A 2-deep line, Campbell's own doctrinal refinement, offered nearly the same firepower density as the 4-deep formation when using the new, faster-loading rifles, while simultaneously presenting a far smaller, harder-to-hit target. The depth that was once required for musketeer shock absorption was now redundant, replaced by the lethal reach of the rifle. His decision at Balaclava to deploy the 93rd in only 2 ranks was therefore the ultimate act of doctrinal revisionism. It was a direct, calculated rejection of the established military orthodoxy. It was an affirmation that discipline, marksmanship, and the superior technology of the Minié rifle had fundamentally inverted the tactical relationship between infantry and cavalry. The successful execution of the thin red line would not only save Balaclava but serve as a chilling, definitive epitaph for the age of massed frontal assaults in European warfare. The 93rd, Sutherland, Highlanders were not merely a collection of men. They were a highly specialized military instrument, the material expression of Sir Colin Campbell's operational doctrine. Their success at Balaclava stemmed directly from their pedigree, their exceptional discipline, and the specific training that made them the ideal, and perhaps the only, regiment capable of executing the high-risk, 2-deep deployment. The regiment's identity was steeped in the military traditions of the Scottish Highlands, which fostered a powerful sense of collective honor and a rigid adherence to duty. This social cohesion was the psychological bedrock of their discipline. While many British regiments relied on a brutal system of lash and fear, the Highlanders were bound by a deeper, more internalized sense of martial pride. This translated directly onto the parade ground and, more importantly, onto the battlefield, allowing for a level of control and precision in maneuvers that few other units could match. Critically, the 93rd had benefited from years of focused training in musketry and drill, a priority championed by officers like Campbell who understood the changing dynamics of fire. They were among the early adopters and proficient users of the emerging Minié rifle, recognizing that the individual soldier's ability to place accurate, sustained fire was now the decisive factor. Their marksmanship, honed through continuous practice, was far superior to the average British infantry unit, whose training often emphasized speed of drill over lethal accuracy. Campbell did not view his infantry as a slow-moving, inaccurate mass. He saw them as a distributed system of mobile, precision firepower. His training focused on the meticulous execution of the volley-firing sequence, loading, sighting, and firing in synchronized, devastating succession. This was essential for the 2-deep line deployment. In a 4-deep formation, any lapse in the discipline of the rear ranks could be absorbed. In a 2-deep line, where every man was exposed and every rifle vital, the slightest faltering in loading or firing would create a fatal gap in the defensive wall. The 93 Roads' innate discipline ensured this would not happen. Furthermore, the regiment's past service contributed significantly to its moral strength. Having served in various theaters, often against hardened opposition, the Highlanders possessed an operational sobriety that distinguished them from regiments whose primary experience was parade ground pomp. They understood the brutal calculus of combat and, crucially, understood the specific nature of the threat posed by massed cavalry. They had internalized the necessary patience, the restraint, required to hold their fire until the charging mass reached the optimal, most lethal range of the rifle. This discipline was directly connected to the concept of firepower density. Campbell's tactical theory required that the narrow, exposed line put out the maximum possible volume of controlled, accurate fire in a short burst. The 93 Roads superior drill ensured that the two ranks could deliver their volleys and reload rapidly, maintaining a continuous, destructive curtain of lead against the charging Russians. Their collective competence transformed a formation that looked thin and vulnerable into one that was, statistically, extremely effective. Thus, the weight of expectation placed on the 93rd at Balaclava was immense, yet entirely justified by their specific capabilities. Campbell trusted them because they were the only force he had whose training matched the revolutionary demands of the moment. Their ability to stand firm, to hold their fire against the intimidating mass of 3,000 oncoming cavalry, and to execute the command to fire with lethal precision, was the ultimate test of their unique pedigree and rigorous, focused training, a test they would pass with historical finality. The moment Sir Colin Campbell received the frantic news that the Turkish redoubts on the causeway heights had been overrun and the Russian cavalry, an immense mass of 3,000 men, was advancing directly toward the exposed port of Balaclava, he faced a tactical choice that few commanders in history would have dared to make. His response was not one of panic, but of chillingly precise calculation, rooted in decades of experience. The decision to deploy the 93rd Highlanders in a two-deep line, the ultimate expression of the doctrine of necessity. The traditional, indeed, mandatory, British and European response to a massed cavalry charge was to form an infantry square. The square was the established defensive mechanism, a four-sided wall of bayonets, presenting no flank to the horsemen, designed for physical absorption of the shock and sustained fire. It was a dense, deep formation that maximized physical cohesion. Any officer who failed to form a square in the face of a large cavalry attack was inviting court-martial, if they survived. Yet, Campbell deliberately rejected this orthodox wisdom. The necessity that drove this unconventional deployment was twofold: numbers and terrain. Firstly, Campbell simply did not possess the numbers to form a viable square, or even the traditional four-deep line, that could also cover the critical breadth of the ground between the sea and the hills where the attack was coming. His entire available force was approximately 550 men of the 93rd. Forming a deep square would have meant covering only a tiny fraction of the necessary defensive perimeter, leaving vast, exploitable flanks. Campbell needed to cover ground, and every single man had to contribute his firepower to the maximum possible extent. Secondly, his reliance was placed entirely on the revolutionary potential of the Minié rifle. As established, the deep formation was a legacy of the inaccurate musket age. Campbell, a pragmatic pioneer of firepower, understood that the new reality was an inverse relationship. Depth was less important than density of fire. A two-deep line, though physically fragile, presented the maximum concentration of rifle muzzles along the required defensive front while simultaneously presenting the narrowest possible target profile to the enemy artillery and incoming horsemen. The decision was, therefore, an act of sheer tactical genius born of pragmatic desperation. Campbell was prioritizing lethal impact over physical shock absorption. His calculation was clear: the Highlanders had to halt the charge not through a wall of bodies, but through a devastating, sustained curtain of fire that would break the Russian formation and morale before they made contact. As the Russian cavalry commander would eventually observe, his troops were charging not into a formation, but into a fire-spitting hedge. The historical account confirms the high-stakes, calculated nature of this gamble. When William Howard Russell, the correspondent for the Times, saw the paltry force deployed in the two thin ranks, he questioned Campbell's deployment, noting the overwhelming odds. Campbell's famous, yet understated, reply that there would be no time for that encapsulates the decisive nature of his command. He was not going to rely on the slow, defensive maneuver of the square. He was committing to an immediate, aggressive doctrine of shock destruction via firepower. This unconventional deployment was not merely about survival, it was a profound doctrinal statement. It demonstrated Campbell's conviction that the disciplined British infantry, armed with the new rifle, could fundamentally reverse the tactical dominance of heavy cavalry that had reigned for centuries. The thin red line was thus a calculated risk, a deliberate exposure of vulnerability balanced by the absolute conviction in the superior technology and the unwavering, deadly discipline of the men who stood in it. The entire defense of the supply port, and indeed the safety of the entire Allied army, rested on the success of this single, audacious, and unorthodox command. The strategic blunder that directly enabled the Russian assault on Balaclava was not a failure of foresight on the part of the men in the field, but a calculated act of strategic deftness orchestrated from the British headquarters on the heights above Sevastopol. The High Command, obsessed with the glory of the siege and paralyzed by arrogance, systematically ignored every warning sign of Prince Menshikov's impending counteroffensive, thereby guaranteeing that Campbell's meager force would face its peril in isolation. The political maneuverings preceding the battle were simple yet devastating: denial and obfuscation. Lord Raglan and his senior staff were operating under a profound tactical conceit that the Russians, having been defeated at the Alma, would remain purely defensive. To acknowledge the possibility of a large-scale Russian flanking maneuver was to admit that the initial invasion strategy was inherently flawed and that their current positioning was dangerously exposed. This admission was politically unacceptable to the aristocratic clique determined to maintain the prestige of the siege. Intelligence, though sporadic and often conflicting due to the abysmal state of the reconnaissance, did exist. Local Cossack movements were reported. Turkish outposts provided credible accounts of large Russian columns massing in the Kurgan Valley. These reports, however, were consistently discounted, minimized, or outright suppressed at headquarters. The prevailing attitude was that such reports were either exaggerations by panicked subordinates or deliberate misdirection by the enemy. This institutionalized blindness was a form of political self-preservation, ensuring that the necessary, painful decision to reinforce Balaclava, which would have required drawing troops away from the siege, was never seriously considered. The command's focus on the siege created an entirely false sense of security regarding the rear. They failed to appreciate that the causeway heights, guarded primarily by Turkish redoubts, were the logical and most vulnerable point of attack. The heights were not properly fortified, and the Allied cavalry, positioned in the South Valley, were dangerously mismanaged and unprepared to act as a proper screening force. The strategic deployment was a testament to wishful thinking rather than sober military assessment. The consequences of this willful ignorance were twofold and direct. Firstly, it ensured that the Turkish forces placed in the redoubts, whom the British High Command clearly considered secondary, were left exposed and unsupported, guaranteeing their rapid collapse when the Russian attack came. Secondly, and most crucially, it meant that Sir Colin Campbell was left with only his own, small contingent to defend the crucial harbour. When the Russian attack did materialize on the morning of October 25, it came as a genuine shock to the senior command miles away, despite the days of mounting evidence. The frantic, late-arriving messages from Balaclava to Raglan's headquarters illustrate the chasm between the tactical reality on the ground and the political fantasy maintained by the generals. This disconnect led to the confusion and conflicting orders that would later define the day, including the disastrous miscommunication that doomed the Light Brigade. In essence, the High Command's actions were a series of calculated non-decisions. They chose to risk the entire logistical base, and the lives of the men defending it, rather than risk the political fallout of admitting a strategic error and adjusting their siege lines. The true burden of command was therefore not merely executing orders, but withstanding the consequences of their superiors' willful strategic blindness. Campbell's success was not achieved with the support of the High Command, but in spite of their politically motivated negligence, which manufactured the very impossible odds he was forced to overcome. The defense of Balaclava hinged not only on the tactical genius of Sir Colin Campbell and the discipline of the 93rd, but fundamentally on the geography of fate, the specific, unforgiving features of the terrain that dictated the Russian approach, constrained the British defense, and ultimately magnified the effect of the thin red line. Any deep scholarly context of the battle must begin with a granular terrain analysis of the ground over which the Russian cavalry advanced and the Highlanders stood. The area surrounding Balaclava consists of three primary, parallel valleys running east-west, separated by low ridges. The North Valley, the site of the infamous Light Brigade charge, the South Valley, where the Heavy Brigade engagement took place, and crucially, the defensive line anchored on the port itself. The most critical topographical feature on October 25 was the Causeway Heights, a low, undulating ridge that ran across the northern flank of the South Valley. This ridge was the linchpin of the entire logistical apparatus. It protected the immediate ground leading to the harbor, acting as a natural shield for the supply port. The presence of 7 Turkish redoubts along this ridge, intended to guard against a Russian flank attack, underscored its strategic importance. When these redoubts were quickly overwhelmed by the initial Russian advance, the entire strategic landscape was inverted. The ridge, once a protective barrier, became the launchpad for the main Russian cavalry assault. The specific characteristics of the South Valley, the area immediately in front of Campbell's deployment, were crucial to the subsequent events. The valley floor here was relatively open and firm, particularly in the vicinity of Cardacoy, where the 93rd was stationed. This open expanse, though somewhat broken by undulating ground, was deemed perfect ground for cavalry. The Russian command, viewing the wide, flat approach, believed their mass charge would achieve maximum momentum and shock effect, unimpeded by serious natural obstacles. This terrain fueled their confidence and reinforced their reliance on outdated cavalry doctrine. Campbell, however, exploited the terrain in a counterintuitive manner. By positioning the 93rd slightly behind a gentle swell in the ground near the village of Cardacoy, he achieved two subtle but vital tactical advantages. Firstly, the slight undulation provided a small, critical measure of defilade, slightly masking his meager force from long-range artillery observation and concealing the exact depth of his line from the advancing cavalry. The Russians would only realize the fragility of the two-deep formation when they were already well within lethal rifle range. Secondly, and most importantly, the open, gentle slope ensured that the Russian cavalry would be forced into a long, visible approach, giving the Highlanders the maximum possible time to execute their disciplined volleys. The ground did not provide any cover for a flanking maneuver, compelling the Russians to make a frontal, concentrated attack directly into the rifle fire, precisely the tactical scenario Campbell's doctrine was designed to exploit. The geography dictated a head-on confrontation, allowing the superior lethality of the Minié rifle to triumph over the sheer mass of the cavalry. The final, fatal geographical constraint was the distance between the Causeway Heights and Campbell's position. This distance, approximately half a mile, was not so great as to allow the Russian charge to lose momentum, but it was perfectly aligned to fall within the optimal killing range of the 93 Rhodes rifles. Had the ground been slightly shorter, the Highlanders might have been overrun. Had it been longer, their fire might have been less concentrated and less psychologically devastating. Thus, the ground itself played the role of a silent, formidable co-commander. It confirmed the Russian general's confidence in a decisive charge, while simultaneously providing Campbell with the exact, unobstructed firing range and frontal approach necessary to validate his radical, two-deep deployment. The stage was set by political treachery, but the final act was choreographed by the unforgiving geometry of the South Valley. The dawn of October 25, 1854, found Sir Colin Campbell in a position of acute, almost unbearable responsibility. His command was not defined by the presence of overwhelming force or robust support, but by its isolation, geographically, doctrinally, and emotionally. This pre-battle period demands scrutiny, for it reveals the extraordinary moral seriousness and unwavering resolution required to execute the unconventional defense that would follow. Campbell was fully aware of the political context of his vulnerability. He knew his small, patchwork force was deployed to guard a vital, exposed artery that his superiors had deemed secondary to the grand theatre of the siege. He understood the unspoken covenant: if Balaclava fell, the blame would settle upon him, the outsider who had failed to hold a position against overwhelming numbers. His isolation was not accidental, it was the scapegoating mechanism of the High Command in action. As the first reports of the Russian advance filtered in, soon confirmed by the smoke and sound of the initial assaults on the Turkish redoubts on the Causeway Heights, Campbell was forced to make decisions that carried the weight of national and personal destiny. He was operating without reliable intelligence from headquarters, which was miles away and engrossed in its own denial. He was effectively cut off, forced to rely entirely on his own judgment, his personal logistical foresight, which had been minimal, given the commissariat's failures, and the intrinsic discipline of the troops immediately at hand. The moral burden was immense. Campbell was an officer who cherished the lives of his men. His long service had instilled in him a profound respect for the cost of war. He knew that the only formation he could feasibly employ, the two-deep line, was an act of calculated desperation. It was a trade-off, maximizing firepower at the cost of catastrophic physical vulnerability should the Russians close the distance. He was gambling the entire existence of the 93rd Highlanders on the efficacy of a technological doctrine that the rest of the army establishment derided. His resolution, however, was absolute. Decades of colonial warfare had stripped him of the illusions of aristocratic military romanticism. He was a professional dealing with brutal facts. The facts were 550 Highlanders against 3,000 Russian cavalry, a vital supply port behind them, and no reinforcements coming. His decision to deploy the line was therefore an act of intellectual courage, a deliberate choice to reject the safety of orthodox doctrine, the square, for the lethal efficiency of the new reality, the rifle line. This moment of isolation also highlights Campbell's leadership philosophy. He did not rely on inspiring rhetoric, he relied on instilled discipline. He trusted the professionalism of the 93rd. As he surveyed the mass of Russian horsemen descending upon the causeway heights, his focus was not on grand strategy, but on ensuring the two thin ranks of his men remained absolutely steady, focused on their sights, and ready to obey the crucial, last-second command. In the minutes leading up to the Russian charge, Campbell's position was the fulcrum upon which the entire battle would turn. He was the solitary military genius whose expertise was the last defense against systemic institutional failure. The weight of the impending battle, the impossible odds, was not merely the numerical disparity. It was the entire political, logistical, and doctrinal negligence of the British state that he now had to personally counteract. His quiet, unflinching resolution at Kardikoy was the first, and most important, victory of the day. The Russian advance that streamed over the causeway heights and into the South Valley was not an unstructured rush, but a formidable display of inherited military power rooted in the traditional doctrine of shock and mass. To the Russian cavalry commander, Major General Rishov, the task was clear, simple, and overwhelmingly achievable: to utilize the momentum of sheer weight of numbers to crush the isolated British position at the port of Balaclava. The core of the Russian plan was to exploit the overwhelming numerical superiority their forces possessed that morning, particularly in cavalry, which totaled nearly 3,000 sabres. Their doctrine regarding cavalry action was centuries old and highly successful in continental European warfare: the mass charge. This tactic relied upon a profound psychological and physical effect. Psychologically, the sight and sound of thousands of horses and men moving at speed, coupled with the glittering flash of steel, was designed to induce immediate panic, causing smaller, less disciplined infantry formations to break before contact. Physically, the dense column or massed formation utilized the kinetic energy of the horses to simply roll over any obstacle in its path, relying on sheer weight rather than distributed firepower. When Rishov's cavalry descended from the heights after witnessing the rapid collapse of the Turkish redoubts, a success that confirmed their tactical expectations, their confidence was absolute. They saw the open, firm ground of the South Valley as the perfect theater for their traditional display of military force. From their perspective, the odds were not merely in their favor, they were an absolute guarantee of success. They believed they were confronting a hastily assembled, demoralized garrison, likely consisting of a few hundred men, who would naturally retreat or form a desperate, easily overrun square. The key tactical error in the Russian perspective lay not in their planning, but in their doctrinal rigidity. They were prepared to fight a battle of 1815, where the smoothbore musket was still the prevailing infantry weapon. Their doctrine had not been updated to account for the revolutionary capabilities of the new British weaponry. The momentum of the charge, which they relied upon, was based on the premise that the infantry's fire would be too inaccurate and too slow to deliver a debilitating effect until the cavalry was already among them. Richau's deployment involved a multi-echeloned attack, designed to hit the defenders in successive, crushing waves. The initial wave, the vanguard, was intended to draw the defensive fire and test the enemy's resolve. The subsequent, heavier masses would then exploit the inevitable gaps and confusion created by the initial impact. This systematic approach had worked countless times against European and Ottoman infantry. However, the sheer speed and commitment of the charge, while imposing, amplified the danger when facing an enemy who refused to conform to expectations. The inertia of the 3,000 horses and men meant that once the momentum was established, it was extremely difficult to halt or change direction. This lack of tactical flexibility was a fatal flaw. When the Russian vanguard encountered not a wavering line or a porous square, but a thin, steady rank that delivered synchronized, highly destructive rifle fire, the resulting shock wave was amplified through the entire charging mass. The psychological impact of the Russian charge on the 93rd was immense, yet the Highlanders, by virtue of their superior discipline, were able to transcend the visceral terror. Conversely, when the Russian cavalry realized the terrifying lethality of the fire coming from the thin red line, their psychological advantage was instantly inverted. The momentum that was supposed to carry them to victory now carried them into an inescapable cone of destruction. The Russian doctrine of overwhelming shock was about to meet the British doctrine of lethal precision, and the outcome would redefine the future of warfare. The decisive factor in the impossible stand was not the number of men but the profound asymmetry of their tools. The engagement at Balaclava was fundamentally a clash between two epochs of military technology: the Minié rifle, representing the industrial future of warfare, and the heavy cavalry saber, representing the pre-industrial past. A detailed weaponry breakdown of the capabilities of the British infantry rifle reveals the new arithmetic of death that rendered the Russian charge obsolete. The Russian cavalry arrived armed primarily with lances, sabers, and carbines, smoothbore firearms whose accuracy and range were minimal. Their doctrine relied on closing the distance quickly, rendering the carbine fire largely irrelevant. The British, specifically the 93rd Highlanders, were equipped with the Patton 1853 Enfield rifle musket, a weapon that fundamentally changed the geometry of the battlefield through the employment of the Minié bore. The technological leap, precision versus volume. The contrast between the old smoothbore musket and the new Minié rifle was stark and critical. The smoothbore musket, like old Russian carbines or British models, used a spherical ball fired from a smoothbore barrel. This resulted in a low effective range of only 80 to 100 yards and was highly inaccurate beyond 50, giving it low lethality as it was designed for mass volume fire. In contrast, the Enfield rifle musket, used by the 93rd Highlanders, utilized a conical, self-expanding Minié ball fired from a rifled barrel, which has spiraled grooves. The tactical consequence of this rifling was that it imparted spin, stabilizing the projectile and leading to increased ballistic efficiency and speed retention. This technological advance dramatically extended the effective range to 300 to 600 yards, accurate up to 400, creating the ability to inflict lethal damage from previously safe distances. The Enfield had high lethality and was designed for individual precision and shock, meaning fewer shots were needed to achieve a kill. The most significant consequence was the extension of the lethal zone. Before the rifle, the cavalry could approach to within 150 yards, a mere 30 seconds gallop, with relative impunity. The rifle extended that zone to over 400 yards. This created a much larger, inescapable cone of fire for the advancing cavalry, forcing them to endure multiple volleys before even reaching the infantry line. The arithmetic of death. Campbell's tactical genius in deploying the two-deep line was directly calculated on the rifle's capabilities. His thin formation achieved a higher density of lethal fire per yard of frontage than a traditional square, because rate of fire and reliability. The percussion cap ignition system was more reliable and slightly faster to reload than the old flintlock, allowing the Highlanders to maintain a rapid, sustained sequence of volleys. Lethality per volley. Because the rifles were accurate, a volley fired at 300 yards was statistically far more devastating than a musket volley fired at 100. Every shot had a vastly increased probability of hitting a horse or a man. This meant that the first 3 volleys delivered by the 93rd would shatter the formation and morale of the Russian advance, a feat impossible with muskets. The simple arithmetic of death was this: in the musket age, 500 infantrymen might require 10 minutes of sustained fire to incapacitate a significant percentage of 3,000 cavalrymen, provided the cavalry did not close first. In the rifle age, 500 Highlanders could deliver a concentrated, paralyzing blow in under 1 minute of precise volley fire. The Minié ball delivered a shock that not only killed but incapacitated the charge's momentum, turning the lead horses into a terrifying, collapsing obstacle for those behind them. Furthermore, the new lethality had a devastating psychological impact not accounted for in Russian doctrine. Cavalry relied on the morale-shattering sight of their approach. When the horses and riders at the front of the charge began to drop suddenly and inexplicably, stricken by unseen shots from extreme range, the psychological effect on the following ranks was profound. The disciplined, unwavering fire of the 93rd was the physical manifestation of this technological advantage, confirming that the age of cavalry dominance, sustained for centuries, had concluded with the introduction of a rifled groove. The battlefield was no longer a realm of close-quarters shock, but a domain defined by lethal distance. The climax of the Russian charge, the moment of supreme decision, was executed not with a chaotic roar, but with a sudden, devastating stillness, followed by a thunderous, calculated expulsion of force. The first volley from the 93rd Highlanders was the technical hinge upon which the entire Battle of Balaclava turned, instantly transforming the overwhelming tactical advantage of the Russian cavalry into a fatal vulnerability. This was the moment the Minié rifle's arithmetic was demonstrated in its most brutal form. As the Russian advance swept past the now abandoned Turkish redoubts and entered the South Valley, their speed and mass created a terrifying momentum. The psychological pressure on the thin red line was immense. 550 men deployed 2 deep faced a cavalry column estimated at 3,000. Under traditional musketeer discipline, the infantry would have been expected to open fire prematurely, driven by panic, scattering their shots and reducing the volume and concentration needed to halt the charge. However, the 93rd, drilled in Campbell's precise doctrine, demonstrated an extraordinary act of restraint. The command was to hold fire until the distance was optimal for lethal effect, a specific range dictated by the Minié rifle's ballistic properties, typically around 300 to 250 yards. This waiting was the critical, counterintuitive maneuver. Every passing second amplified the Russian momentum, yet every second the Highlanders held their fire increased the certainty of the destruction they were about to unleash. The technical execution of the volley. The execution of the first volley was a masterpiece of military drill. It required not just courage, but perfect synchronization and precise aiming, achieved through the established command structure. The command, Campbell's ADC, John Archibald Cunningham, reportedly shouted the crucial instruction, ensuring the line remained steady. 93rd. All to their front. There is no retreat from here, men. You must fire low. Sighting and stance. Unlike smoothbore fire, which was aimed high to compensate for poor trajectory, the Highlanders were ordered to aim low, targeting the oncoming horses and the lower torsos of the riders. This guaranteed that even a slightly high shot would still strike a target. The trigger, when the leading horses were within the designated killing zone, the command to fire was given. The 2 ranks, the front rank kneeling, the rear rank standing, discharged their weapons almost simultaneously. The immediate effect was devastating. Unlike the ragged, dispersed impact of musket fire, the Minié balls, traveling with superior velocity and accuracy, struck the concentrated head of the Russian column with terrifying uniformity. The first volley instantly transformed the perfectly formed vanguard of the charge into a mass of falling, screaming horses and men. The horses, struck primarily in the chest and forelegs, piled up, creating an immediate, impassable barrier of panicked flesh and broken momentum. The psychological and tactical shockwave. The tactical objective of the first volley was not merely casualty infliction, it was momentum disruption. The sudden, concentrated loss of over 100 horses and men in the vanguard shattered the cohesion of the entire Russian column, transmitting a shockwave back through the following ranks. The Russian cavalry doctrine relied on an unbroken flow to crash into the infantry. When the flow was violently arrested, the following echelons were suddenly confronted not with an easy target, but with a terrifying, unpredictable obstacle of their own dead and wounded. This technical success had an instantaneous psychological consequence. The Russians, trained to expect a visible, conventional defense, were confronted by a volume of fire and a lethal reach they had not anticipated. They saw their vanguard disintegrate into chaos, and this realization, that the fundamental tactical premise of their charge was now invalid, led to a momentary, fatal hesitation. Campbell's decision to adopt the two-deep line proved its worth in this exact moment. The line had withstood the psychological test and delivered a perfectly concentrated blow. The technical mechanics of the Minié rifle, guided by the unwavering discipline of the Highlanders, had achieved the impossible, the annihilation of the momentum of a massed cavalry charge with a single, synchronized act of superior firepower. The battle was far from over, but the structural integrity of the Russian attack had been irrevocably broken by the efficiency of that initial, shattering volley. The success of the thin red line cannot be fully appreciated without dissecting the immense psychological pressure that preceded the technical act of firing. Chapter 15 must focus on the crucial, counterintuitive order given by Sir Colin Campbell, the command to hold fire, and the extraordinary discipline to wait demonstrated by the 93rd Highlanders, which was the final, non-technological component of the victory. This discipline was the supreme act of will that leveraged the technological advantage of the Minié rifle. The innate human reaction when faced with an overwhelming, terrifying threat like a massed cavalry charge is panic, manifesting as a premature, uncoordinated discharge of weapons. This instinctual response is precisely what centuries of European cavalry doctrine relied upon. A premature volley, fired too early, would be largely ineffective, with the majority of the low-velocity musket balls falling short or scattering widely. The subsequent time required for reloading would allow the cavalry to close the final, fatal gap, achieving the physical shock necessary to break the line. Campbell's order, therefore, demanded a deliberate, conscious rejection of this survival instinct. He understood the technical imperative. The Minié rifle's lethality peaked within a specific range, maximizing velocity and minimizing the time the Russian cavalry had to react to the inevitable carnage. Firing at 500 yards, while possible, would merely wound and alert the enemy. Firing at 250 yards, however, maximized the kill rate and guaranteed a devastating concentration of impact at the head of the column. The psychology of restraint. The delay, the agonizing minutes of watching 3,000 horsemen thundering toward them, was the true test of the 93 roads discipline. This was not mere stoicism, it was intellectual discipline applied under mortal threat. Every man in the line had to override the instinct to pull the trigger, trusting implicitly in Campbell's calculation and their regiment's training. This requires a level of internalized cohesion rarely seen in armies of that era, particularly those ravaged by disease and supply failures. The command, repeated down the ranks, was simple: wait. Wait until the officers gave the order. Wait until the distance was exactly right. The physical reality of the oncoming charge, the thunder of hooves, the shaking ground, the visual spectacle of the immense mass, is almost impossible to convey, yet the Highlanders held their positions, motionless and silent, a thin red line of perfect, terrifying composure. This discipline was the vital bridge between weaponry capability and tactical effect. The rifle provided the potential for devastation. The discipline to wait ensured that potential was fully realized. Had the 93rd cracked and fired early, the Russian momentum would have continued, their formation remaining largely intact as they closed the distance. The psychological advantage, the shock of the oncoming mass, would have overwhelmed the line, and the port would have been lost. The contrast with conventional doctrine. The discipline to wait highlights the deep contrast between Campbell's doctrine and the prevailing British orthodoxy. The traditional doctrine placed supreme faith in the bayonet charge, relying on a close-quarters melee after a quick, inaccurate volley. Campbell, however, was relying on the destructive power of precision fire delivered at maximum lethality, thereby preempting the melee entirely. His strategy was to destroy the charge's cohesion and morale from a distance, rendering the need for a physical shock-absorbing formation, the square, redundant. The moment the command to fire finally rang out, it was a release of not only lead but also pent-up tension. The timing was so precisely judged that the resulting carnage, the piling up of horses and men, was immediate and spectacular, a direct result of the discipline to allow the enemy to enter the most destructive range. The shattered remnants of the first Russian echelon recoiled not because they met a physical barrier, but because they met a wall of instant, coordinated death that violated every expectation of cavalry warfare. In conclusion, the command to wait was the most counterintuitive, yet most essential, order of the day. It was the moment the 93rd Highlanders demonstrated that true military genius lay not just in new weapons, but in the unflinching human will to apply those weapons according to a cold, hard, statistical calculation, regardless of the terror it induced. They did not retreat, they did not fire early. They waited, and in that waiting, they won. The true tactical brilliance of the thin red line lies in its operational efficiency, requiring a section-by-section analysis of firepower to understand how Campbell's two-deep formation achieved a localized superiority of force against the immense Russian mass. The battlefield at Kardikoy was a microcosm where the linear mathematics of the Minié rifle irrevocably shattered the three-dimensional geometry of the cavalry charge. Campbell's deployment was not a uniform, unbroken line but a series of concentrated, highly disciplined firing blocks designed to maximize the sustained output of lead across the necessary frontage. The key operational concept was firepower density, achieving the highest number of effective projectiles per linear yard of defense. Because the 93rd was only 2 ranks deep, every single soldier was simultaneously a primary target and a primary shooter. This meant that nearly 100% of the regiment's available musketry was brought to bear immediately and simultaneously, a level of efficiency impossible in the traditional 4-deep line where the rear ranks often struggled to fire effectively. Analysis of the firing sequence. The engagement broke down into several critical, measured phases, each dictated by the rifle's effective range. Phase 1, the distant approach, 400+ yards at this range. Campbell kept the entire line silent and steady. This was a crucial test of discipline, as any premature firing would have wasted ammunition and compromised the element of tactical surprise. The lack of fire reinforced the Russian assumption that the line was small and likely panicked, encouraging them to maintain their momentum. Phase 2, the point of maximum lethality, 300 to 250 yards. This was the zone where the first, devastating volley was unleashed, as detailed in Chapter 14. The entire 550-man line, firing nearly 1,100 bullets almost simultaneously, accounting for the 2 ranks, targeted the front rank of the Russian column. The aim was not to wound, but to kill and disable the horses in the vanguard. The sudden, massed collapse of the lead animals created a catastrophic, physical obstacle for the subsequent ranks, disrupting the crucial momentum and cohesion. Sustained fire and the 2-rank system. The second, equally vital component of the tactical breakdown was the maintenance of sustained fire, the rapid reloading and firing cycle executed by the 2 ranks. The front rank delivered its fire, then knelt to rapidly reload. The rear rank simultaneously moved up or stepped sideways to deliver the second volley over the heads of the kneeling front rank. This coordinated drill ensured that the Russian cavalry was not granted a single moment of respite during their approach. As the shattered vanguard recoiled or struggled through the wreckage of their own charge, the 93rd was delivering subsequent, punishing volleys. Crucially, the short reloading time of the rifle musket meant that the front rank was often ready to rise and fire a third volley before the nearest remaining Russian horseman could decide whether to attempt to bypass the chaos or fully retreat. The effect was geometric. The 2-deep line created a cone of destruction that focused lethal force directly onto the concentrated Russian target. The Russian density, which was intended to be their strength, became their most profound weakness. The Minié ball, unlike the musket ball, penetrated deep and traveled straight, ensuring that shots that missed the intended target in the first rank often struck a horse or rider in the second or third rank of the tight Russian formation. The specific maneuver that cemented the victory was the rapid formation of a small flanking element. When a section of Russian cavalry veered off to the left, threatening to roll up the exposed flank of the 93rd, Campbell reportedly issued the order, 93rd, form into a single file and front the enemy. While the exact formation executed was a swift, partial wheeling motion rather than a formal file, the effect was immediate. A portion of the line rapidly shifted its alignment to present a new, continuous wall of two-deep fire directly into the path of the maneuvering Russians. This instantaneous tactical flexibility demonstrated the regiment's inherent discipline and Campbell's minute-by-minute control over the battlefield microcosm. The flanking move was crushed before it could fully develop, reinforcing the Russian realization that there was no weak point to exploit in this astonishingly effective, thin red hedge of steel and fire. The engagement was a perfect, technical victory for firepower over shock. The destruction of the Russian vanguard by the synchronized fire of the 93rd Highlanders was the decisive moment, but the victory was not yet secured. Cavalry warfare is inherently fluid, and even after suffering devastating losses, the Russian force, observing the extreme thinness of the British line, recognized the vulnerability of the flank. Chapter 17 must analyze this moment of peril, the attempt to roll up Campbell's position, and the crucial, instantaneous command intervention that sealed the defense. As the main body of the Russian charge recoiled in shock and disorder from the concentrated fire, a significant contingent, estimated at several hundred horsemen, detached from the main mass and wheeled sharply to the left, the eastern flank. Their objective was sound and conventional, to bypass the destructive frontal fire and exploit the exposed end of the two-deep line. This was the most serious threat to the thin red line, for the linear formation, which maximized firepower, was inherently susceptible to being turned and attacked from the side, where the men could not bring their rifles to bear effectively. This flanking maneuver was the last gasp of Russian doctrinal hope. Had they succeeded, they would have been able to roll up the Highlanders from end to end, turning the defensive line into a chaotic rout and opening the path directly to the Balaclava port. The sheer speed of the cavalry meant that there was no time for reinforcements, and the main British High Command, miles away, could offer no immediate assistance. The crisis was immediate, localized, and rested entirely on the presence of mind of Sir Colin Campbell. Campbell's response was a testament to his decades of hard-won field experience and his constant, minute-by-minute oversight of the battle's tactical progression. He had not relinquished command to his subordinate officers. He was a dynamic, hands-on general whose personal intervention was often the difference between success and failure. As the Russian flanking move became clear, Campbell issued a sharp, precise, and counterintuitive command to the leftmost companies of the 93rd. The exact language of the order, often debated in historical texts, was focused on changing the angle of fire without compromising the main line's integrity. Instead of ordering a full square or a major defensive shift, maneuvers that would have been too slow and created chaos, Campbell ordered the flank companies to refuse their flank. This tactical term means wheeling the end of the line backward at a slight angle, effectively creating a new, short face of fire pointed directly at the oncoming flankers. This quick maneuver created a right angle with the main line, a makeshift defensive corner. The execution of this crucial intervention was flawless, again demonstrating the astonishing discipline of the Highlanders. They executed the wheeling movement instantly, bringing a fresh volume of rifle fire to bear on the now exposed flank of the Russian detachment. The Russian cavalry, having successfully bypassed the main danger only to be confronted by a sudden, new, and equally lethal wall of Minié fire, were caught completely by surprise. Their formation, already fragmented from the chaos of the main charge, could not absorb this unexpected second shock. The psychological effect was immediate and terminal for the Russian attack. They realized that their primary tactical advantage, the ability to exploit the linear formation's flank, had been instantly negated by the professional genius of the British commander. The flanking detachment was quickly repelled, some riders joining the general disorder, others simply fleeing the field. This precise, small-scale maneuver was the final confirmation that Campbell's force, though small, was tactically impregnable in its current deployment. This moment of peril and Campbell's intervention elevated the engagement from a mere display of defensive courage into a masterclass of dynamic command. It proved that Campbell was not simply a commander who adopted a strong initial position, he was one who retained full, agile control over his formation throughout the engagement. His ability to issue the correct, precise order under the most intense pressure, and the soldier's ability to execute the complex movement instantly, sealed the tactical victory and prevented the inevitable catastrophic loss of Balaclava. The Russian realization that they had failed to turn the flank was the final confirmation that the doctrine of shock had been decisively defeated by the doctrine of precision fire. The failure of the Russian charge against the thin red line was not merely a physical defeat quantified by casualties. It was, more profoundly, the collapse of a centuries-old military doctrine rooted in psychology. Chapter 18 must delve into the deep psychological shock inflicted upon the Russian cavalry, analyzing how the disciplined application of modern firepower inverted the conventional power dynamic and destroyed the fundamental premise of the massed cavalry assault. The conventional power of heavy cavalry rested entirely on psychological dominance. The sheer spectacle of thousands of horsemen, moving at speed, was designed to inspire immediate terror and induce a catastrophic loss of nerve in the opposing infantry. In the musket age, infantry often wavered, fired too early, or broke formation, confirming the cavalry's perceived invincibility. The Russian generals confidently relied upon this tested formula. They expected the mere sight of their charge to rout the handful of Highlanders. The inversion of psychological shock. The psychological shock inflicted at Balaclava was unique because it was inverted. It struck the attackers, not the defenders. When the Russian vanguard encountered the first, coordinated volley, the reaction was not merely one of being shot at, but of confronting a phenomenon outside their doctrinal experience. Lethality at distance, the Minié rifle fire, lethal at ranges previously considered safe, meant that the destruction began before the cavalry had closed to the distance necessary to create psychological terror. The Russians were being struck by an unseen, pervasive lethality that violated the established rules of combat. Destruction of cohesion. Cavalry shock relies on unbroken continuity of mass. The instant the lead horses and riders began to drop in piles, the physical integrity of the column was shattered. The following ranks were suddenly confronted not with a solid enemy line, but with the terrifying, chaotic obstacle of their own dead and wounded. This immediately introduced disorder and self-preservation into a formation built entirely on mass obedience and forward momentum. The loss of initiative. The Russian cavalry doctrine dictated that they seize the initiative immediately upon charging. The devastating effect of the too-deep line wrested that initiative away. The Russians were forced to slow, to navigate the carnage, and, most fatally, to think about their next move. When a cavalry charge is compelled to stop and think, its doctrinal effectiveness is already zero. The breakdown of faith. The systemic failure of the Russian attack was a crisis of faith in their own military tenets. For centuries, the cavalry charge was the ultimate solution, a blunt, irresistible instrument of war. At Balaclava, the Highlanders demonstrated that this instrument was now obsolete. The realization that their speed, mass, and prestige were utterly useless against a thin line of disciplined men with modern rifles was a profound moral defeat. The subsequent flanking attempt, as detailed in Chapter 17, was a desperate, if logical, response to this shock. It was an attempt to revert to a conventional maneuver after the frontal attack had failed. Its quick failure, however, confirmed the fatal truth: there was no exploitable weakness in the disciplined British defense. The ultimate collapse of doctrine manifested in the final, decisive action, the Russian retreat. It was not a rout in the traditional sense, but an organized, yet deeply demoralized, withdrawal. They recoiled not because they lacked courage, but because their tactical calculus had failed utterly. The engagement proved that the infantry, through technology and discipline, now held the absolute power to dictate the terms of engagement, turning the hunter into the hunted. The legacy of this moment was not only the saving of the Balaclava port but a stark lesson for all European military establishments. Sir Colin Campbell and the 93rd Highlanders had delivered the definitive obituary for the age of massed cavalry dominance. They proved that the Minié rifle was not merely an improved weapon, it was a doctrinal equalizer that inverted the psychological leverage of combat, confirming that the soldier who stood his ground and delivered precise fire could defeat a force 10 times his size, simply because he adhered to the new, brutal arithmetic of death. The shock was so profound that it would take years for the British High Command to politically digest the uncomfortable truth of the event. The moment the last, shattered remnants of the Russian cavalry recoiled, leaving the South Valley and retreating back over the Causeway Heights, an unnerving field of silence descended upon the sector occupied by the 93rd Highlanders. This immediate aftermath was a period of profound, solemn reckoning, a cold, clinical assessment of the human cost that stood in stark contrast to the spectacular chaos of the preceding charge. The most arresting observation was the sheer, impossible imbalance of the battle's ledger, a metric that unequivocally confirmed the triumph of Campbell's doctrine and the devastating efficiency of the Minié rifle. The ground immediately in front of the thin red line was testimony to the concentrated lethality of the synchronized volleys. It was choked with a horrifying, dense mass of fallen horses and men, a chaotic wreckage that spoke volumes about the surgical precision of the British fire. The estimated Russian losses in this specific engagement, though difficult to calculate precisely due to the subsequent confusion of the wider battle, were undeniably significant, particularly among the officers and the horses in the vanguard, whose loss instantly paralyzed the charge. The field was littered with the evidence of high-velocity, accurate impacts, demonstrating that the Highlanders had successfully maintained fire discipline and executed their aim to strike low, destroying the physical foundation of the cavalry, the horse, and trapping the riders beneath. In chilling contrast, the line of the 93rd Highlanders stood almost intact. Their casualties were astonishingly light, a handful of men wounded, fewer still killed. This minimal loss was the true, undeniable verdict on the tactical decision to deploy in two ranks. Had they formed a conventional square, they would have presented a denser, more vulnerable target for the preliminary artillery fire and the subsequent close-quarters melee. By prioritizing firepower density over physical depth, Campbell ensured that the superior lethality of the rifle compensated for the numerical disparity, turning a potential massacre into a clinical, one-sided destruction of the opposing force. The balance sheet of the engagement was a shocking indictment of the Russian command's rigid adherence to obsolete doctrine. Yet, this moment of strategic security was quickly complicated by the overwhelming logistical reality facing the Highlanders. While they had secured the port, they were exhausted, having been on high alert and battling the elements and illness for weeks. The meager provisions provided by the commissariat meant their physical reserves were depleted. The victory was a moral and tactical triumph, but it did nothing to alleviate the systemic suffering of the British forces. The soldiers of the 93rd had proven they could defeat overwhelming odds in combat, but they remained vulnerable to the institutional neglect emanating from headquarters. The quiet of the battlefield did not last. Even as the Highlanders secured their position, the battle continued elsewhere, rapidly shifting focus to the two subsequent, more politically dramatic engagements, the successful charge of the Heavy Brigade and the disastrous, legendary charge of the Light Brigade in the North Valley. The success of the 93rd Highlanders quickly became a necessary, but ultimately uncomfortable, truth for the senior command. Their effective stand had saved the supply base, but it was a victory won by an unconventional general and an outsider regiment, utilizing a doctrine that challenged the competence of the very officers sitting in judgment. This successful defense was immediately woven into the larger, chaotic fabric of the day. Its true strategic consequence, the preservation of the British logistical lifeline at Balaclava, was immense, ensuring the Allies could continue the siege of Sevastopol through the brutal winter to come. But politically, its simplicity and success lacked the dramatic, sacrificial narrative that the establishment would later crave. The cost of the stand was minimal in blood for the 93rd, but profound in its implications for the political and military elite who would soon find it more convenient to celebrate spectacular failure than quiet, tactical genius. The field of silence was soon broken by the shouts of subsequent, more memorable, and more tragic engagements, ensuring that the Thin Red Line would, almost immediately, begin its relegation to a historical footnote. The roar of the cannon had barely faded before the political establishment in London commenced the necessary work of rewriting history. The victory of the Thin Red Line, a triumph of professional doctrine over overwhelming odds, was instantly inconvenient. It was a victory won by an institutional outsider, Sir Colin Campbell, and highlighted the catastrophic failures of logistics and strategic command perpetrated by the aristocratic clique in charge. To preserve the reputations of the politically connected generals, Lord Raglan and his staff, the true nature of the day had to be swiftly obscured, leading to the inevitable lie, the deliberate crafting of a narrative where strategic failure became glorious sacrifice. The primary political imperative was deflection. The Battle of Balaclava had starkly exposed the ineptitude of the British High Command. The initial loss of the Turkish redoubts, the near loss of the crucial supply port, and the subsequent disastrous miscommunication that led to the charge of the Light Brigade. This confluence of blunders threatened the prestige of the entire expedition and, by extension, the government that authorized it. Therefore, a distraction of spectacular magnitude was required. The charge of the Light Brigade provided this perfect narrative foil. It was a tragedy of heroic, yet futile, obedience. It was a disaster that could be framed as a quintessential British virtue, valor amidst miscommunication, rather than as the result of systemic, deeply embedded incompetence. The sacrifice of the cavalry became the focal point of the narrative precisely because it was strategically meaningless and tactically disastrous. It offered no hard, challenging lessons about modern warfare or doctrinal reform, thus posing no threat to the established military hierarchy. It was emotionally resonant, easily understood, and, most importantly, deflective. The narrative crafted in the dispatches sent back to Whitehall, and subsequently magnified by the press correspondent William Howard Russell, who was himself profoundly moved by the Light Brigade's gallantry, despite his prior reporting on the Thin Red Line, focused almost exclusively on the tragic valley. The initial, successful defense of the port by Campbell and the 93rd was relegated to a minor, quickly disposed of preliminary skirmish. The language used by the establishment was key. The Light Brigade's charge was elevated to the status of a sublime, if sorrowful, act of heroism. Campbell's defense, by contrast, was described in terms that diminished its tactical genius. The Thin Red Line became a simple, memorable phrase, a nod to the bravery of the Scots, but stripped of its profound doctrinal and technological context. It was praised as courage but not genius. This subtle distinction was crucial. Courage is innate and requires no special training or unconventional thought. Genius demands acknowledging the revolutionary competence of a professional outsider. Politically, accepting the magnitude of Campbell's success meant acknowledging that a too-deep line of disciplined riflemen could defeat mass cavalry, which, in turn, would necessitate a complete overhaul of training, recruitment, and command structure, a painful, politically destabilizing process. It was far easier to allow the Light Brigade's tragedy to dominate the public imagination, ensuring the focus remained on the cavalry's aristocratic gallantry rather than the Highlanders' professional efficiency. Furthermore, the initial success of the Heavy Brigade in the South Valley was also strategically amplified over Campbell's contribution. The Heavy Brigade was commanded by officers firmly embedded within the aristocratic system. Their victory could be safely celebrated as a triumph of traditional British cavalry prowess. The official reports subtly linked the Heavy Brigade's success and the Light Brigade's sacrifice, creating a convenient, unitary narrative of aristocratic heroism that successfully eclipsed the inconvenient, technical genius of the infantry commander who had truly saved the day. The inevitable lie was thus established. The Battle of Balaclava was the story of the Light Brigade. This deliberate, calculated manipulation of the historical record served the highest political need, protecting the reputations of the elite, maintaining the rigid class structure of the army, and avoiding the necessary but painful institutional reform that the impossible stand of the 93rd Highlanders had so clearly dictated. The truth was deemed too disruptive to the established order. The historical dominance of the charge of the Light Brigade is a testament to the power of a compelling, albeit tragic, narrative, and its utility in serving political expediency. Chapter 21 must analyze how this catastrophic event cast a profound shadow that enveloped the quiet, critical success of the Thin Red Line, thereby operating as the perfect diversion of historical attention away from the profound lessons of the 93rd Highlanders' tactical victory and the systemic incompetence that defined the Crimean War. The sheer spectacle of the Light Brigade's charge, the magnificent visual of hundreds of men riding into the Valley of Death, provided an immediate, visceral, and emotionally charged narrative that was irresistible to the Victorian public and, more importantly, to the politically motivated press. It possessed all the ingredients necessary for a spectacular legend: aristocratic gallantry, heroic obedience to a flawed order, and tragic, large-scale sacrifice. It was a failure so grand that it transcended mere incompetence and was immediately elevated into a moral fable about the unquestioning courage of the British soldier. This moral elevation was precisely what the establishment required to survive the political fallout of the larger battle. The Light Brigade's fate was a singular, tragic moment that could be isolated and mourned, allowing the focus to be pulled away from the sustained, systemic failure that preceded and followed it. The core strategic truth of Balaclava was the near loss of the port due to poor preparation and the fact that the entire logistical apparatus was saved by an unconventional general and his disciplined infantry. The Thin Red Line was a victory of doctrine and professionalism. It was a success of how rather than what. This intellectual, unromanticized success offered no comforting, simple answers, and it demanded uncomfortable changes in military policy. The shadow of the Light Brigade was deployed as a deliberate deflection from these uncomfortable truths. By focusing public discourse and historical documentation almost entirely on the North Valley, the narrative successfully marginalized two crucial, challenging facts. The systemic flaw, the catastrophic failure of the supply chain and command structure that left Balaclava defenseless in the first place, necessitating Campbell's impossible stand, was immediately obscured. The tragedy became a symptom of a single mistake, not a culmination of systemic rot. The new doctrine, the revolutionary tactical implications of Campbell's too-deep deployment were ignored. The 93 road success proved that the age of massed cavalry was over and that the future belonged to disciplined, rifle-armed infantry, a truth that the conservative, cavalry-dominated British military hierarchy was simply not ready to accept. The poetry of Alfred, Lord Tennyson cemented this diversion in the public mind. His famous verses, commissioned by the government and published soon after, transformed the charge into an enduring cultural touchstone, celebrating the men's devotion to duty. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. The verses made no mention of the 93rd Highlanders, who had, against staggering odds, actually prevented the complete collapse of the British position. The poetic license became political reality, embedding the charge of the Light Brigade as the definitive, singular event of the battle. Even the reporting of William Howard Russell, whose earlier dispatches exposed the dire logistical failures, inadvertently contributed to this diversion. While he reported Campbell's stand, his dispatches about the Light Brigade were so immediate and moving that they consumed the public's attention, ensuring that the visual and emotional drama of the charge overwhelmed the colder, technical success of the defense. This diversion of historical attention was a political triumph. It allowed the British government to claim moral victory in the face of logistical incompetence, to preserve the careers of its aristocratic commanders, and, critically, to delay for decades the necessary doctrinal reforms that Campbell's impossible stand had clearly mandated. The enduring shadow cast by the Light Brigade was therefore not just a historical accident, it was an indispensable political tool used to suppress a disruptive truth. The reports detailing the Battle of Balaclava, once reaching the political and military establishment in London, Whitehall and the Horse Guards, underwent an immediate and necessary process of filtration and sanitization. The assessment was not a clinical evaluation of tactics or logistics, but a deeply cynical, politically motivated retreat from reality. The primary objective was not to learn from the victory, but to minimize its implications and prevent the truth of the preceding failures from destabilizing the government and the established military order. The triumph of the 93rd Highlanders, the successful defense of the vital supply port, was acknowledged only because it could not be completely ignored. However, this success was greeted with distinct political coolness. Sir Colin Campbell, the professional outsider, was neither a favourite of the aristocratic commander-in-chief, Lord Raglan, nor of the powerful clique that surrounded him. Campbell's victory, achieved through unorthodox means and rigid professional discipline, was a powerful, silent indictment of the systemic incompetence that had left the port so exposed in the first place. Therefore, Campbell's achievement had to be downplayed and depersonalized. The official assessment focused on the strategic result: the port was saved, while carefully eliding the how. The victory was attributed vaguely to British tenacity and the valor of the troops, carefully avoiding any specific mention of Campbell's unconventional two-deep deployment or the revolutionary efficiency of the Minié rifle. To focus on the two-deep line was to credit Campbell's tactical genius and, by extension, to question why the rest of the army was not trained to the same professional standard, a question that cut directly to the heart of the aristocratic officer purchase system. Crucially, the political maneuvering ensured the victory of the 93rd was viewed as an isolated event, rather than a doctrinal blueprint. The entire focus shifted immediately to damage control over the twin disasters that followed: the loss of the Turkish redoubts, which highlighted poor Allied coordination, and, most urgently, the catastrophic charge of the Light Brigade. The immediate strategic consequence of Campbell's success, the preservation of the British base, was immense. Without Balaclava, the entire Allied siege of Sevastopol would have collapsed, forcing a disastrous withdrawal just as winter was approaching. This strategic fact was undeniable, but Whitehall ensured it received a low profile. By placing the narrative emphasis on the Light Brigade, the politicians created a smokescreen of emotional sacrifice, allowing them to deflect public scrutiny from the mundane, but fatal, realities of administrative failure. The assessment of the battle's command structure was also a study in political protectionism. Lord Raglan, whose distant and often confusing orders led to the Light Brigade disaster, faced minimal censure. The investigation was carefully managed to focus on the immediate communication failure in the field rather than the structural flaw of his leadership and the systemic incompetence of his staff. The system protected its own. The political connections and aristocratic prestige of the senior officers proved more important than a truthful reckoning of their professional failures. The ultimate conclusion drawn in London was not to reform the army based on the principles of professional competence demonstrated by Campbell, but to maintain the status quo and blame the logistical failures on the unavoidable difficulties of foreign campaigning. The victory of the 93rd Highlanders was treated as an inconvenient, small-scale anomaly, a fortunate stroke of localized genius, rather than the clarion call for doctrinal reform it actually was. The truth was sacrificed on the altar of political survival, ensuring that the necessary institutional reckoning was effectively delayed for decades. The victory of the Thin Red Line was secured by the disciplined resolve of the common soldiers of the 93rd Highlanders, yet the subsequent fate of the common soldier was defined by a profound gulf between their extraordinary battlefield conduct and the meager official recognition they received. This disparity highlights the systemic nature of institutional amnesia within the Victorian military establishment, which chose to celebrate aristocratic tragedy over professional, working-class success. In the immediate aftermath, the common soldier of the 93rd was subjected to the same brutal conditions that afflicted the rest of the British forces. Having survived the Russian cavalry charge, they still had to face the inevitable logistical collapse of the approaching Crimean winter, enduring months of inadequate clothing, insufficient rations, and rampant disease. Their supreme effort at Balaclava did not earn them any preferential treatment. They were simply returned to the freezing, muddy trenches. For the private soldiers, the battle against the Russian Empire was often less deadly than the prolonged, systemic battle against commissariat failure and official neglect. The lack of proportional recognition for the men of the 93rd was a calculated outcome of the dominant political narrative. While the survivors of the Light Brigade, many of whom came from the commissioned ranks or the gentry, received immediate, sensationalized acclaim, including public testimonial funds and high-profile commemorations, the disciplined effort of the Highlanders was quietly subsumed into the general category of duty well done. The official awards and mentions were scarce and deliberately understated. The prevailing military culture of the day dictated that heroism was best embodied by the officer class and in acts of noble sacrifice, like the Light Brigade, not in the cold, efficient execution of professional doctrine by rank-and-file infantrymen. Campbell's victory was a testament to the latter, making it difficult for the aristocratic establishment to celebrate without undermining their own system. To lavish praise and awards on the common Highlander was to imply that training and professional skill, which could be attained by any class, were more vital than lineage and purchase, a concept deeply threatening to the social structure of the army. The result was an active institutional amnesia. The specific details of the two-deep deployment and the individual acts of discipline that secured the victory were slowly eroded from the official memory. The phrase, "the thin red line," while capturing the spirit of courage, deliberately stripped the event of its essential tactical context. It became a romantic abstraction, easily celebrated, yet safely disconnected from the revolutionary doctrinal lessons that Sir Colin Campbell had intended. Furthermore, the post-war life of many Highlanders mirrored the institutional neglect they experienced in the Crimea. While a few men might have been decorated with the newly instituted Victoria Cross in subsequent actions, the vast majority returned to civilian life with little fanfare, struggling to find work and often suffering from the physical and psychological scars of the campaign. There was no coherent state system for veteran support. Their sacrifice was valued in the immediate moment of national danger, but swiftly forgotten once the political crisis subsided. In the long view, the fate of the common soldier in the 93rd Highlanders crystallizes the central hypocrisy of the Crimean War's official legacy. They were the men whose skill and discipline saved the Allied position from catastrophe, yet their professional triumph was intentionally obscured by the sensational shadow of aristocratic failure. Their quiet, technical victory was a truth too politically potent for the establishment to embrace, ensuring that their recognition was minimal and their true significance was buried beneath layers of political expediency and narrative romance, delaying vital army reforms until after the further institutional shocks of the Indian Mutiny. The triumph of the thin red line provided Sir Colin Campbell with an enduring, yet deeply complicated, legacy, a testament to his tactical genius that was simultaneously a source of institutional resentment and delayed justice. The immediate aftermath of Balaclava confirmed his brilliance, but it also cemented his status as a permanent outsider whose competence was a continuous threat to the established military hierarchy. Campbell's primary lasting contribution was not the single defense of Balaclava, but the doctrine of discipline and sustained fire that he perfected and demonstrated. The engagement served as empirical proof that the technological leap of the Minié rifle, when coupled with rigorous training and the moral courage to adopt unorthodox, high-risk formations, had fundamentally inverted the tactical relationship between infantry and cavalry. This lesson, that firepower density trumped physical mass, was delivered at the cost of Russian lives but was largely ignored by his own aristocratic superiors. Despite the undeniable strategic consequence of his actions, the saving of the main supply base, Campbell was not immediately rewarded or elevated. His career progression remained grudging and slow, a casualty of the very political maneuvering detailed earlier. The aristocratic officers who failed in the North Valley suffered less professional damage than Campbell, the professional, who succeeded. His promotion to higher command remained delayed justice, granted only after the political shockwaves of the Crimean War subsided, and then only because the empire faced another, more pressing crisis. This vindication finally arrived 3 years later during the Indian Mutiny, 1857. When the entirety of British rule in India faced collapse, the political elite, having exhausted their favoured candidates, were compelled by sheer necessity to turn to the most reliable professional they had deliberately sidelined. Campbell was appointed Commander-in-Chief in India. His command throughout the mutiny, particularly the relief of Lucknow, was a masterclass in his trademark qualities: meticulous logistics, minimal casualties, and absolute reliance on the disciplined proficiency of his infantry. Crucially, Campbell's success in India directly utilized the lessons he championed at Balaclava. He prioritized the professional soldier and sound, defensive tactics, proving his doctrine was not a one-off improvisation but a coherent philosophy of modern warfare. This success cemented his historical stature, not merely as the commander of the 93rd at Balaclava, but as the architect of modern, professional British infantry tactics. However, his legacy is perpetually shadowed by the fact that the British military establishment learned the necessary lessons too late. The true justice for Campbell would have been the immediate and comprehensive reform of the army based on his principles after 1854. Instead, the army continued to rely on the purchase system and outdated doctrine for another 2 decades, costing countless lives in subsequent conflicts. Campbell was elevated and ultimately ennobled, becoming Lord Clyde, but only after the institutional damage he warned against had been fully realized across the empire. Campbell's final legacy, therefore, is one of bittersweet triumph. He was the forgotten genius who saved the day with unconventional brilliance, whose doctrine was ultimately validated by necessity and history, but whose professional worth was deliberately discounted by a class system more concerned with social preservation than military efficacy. His final honors were granted to the hero who saved India, but the true foundational act of his genius remained the impossible stand in the South Valley of Balaclava, an event that forever linked doctrine, discipline, and the agonizing path to delayed justice. The ultimate judgment upon the impossible stand of the 93rd Highlanders is not found in the celebration of victory, but in the unsettling reckoning of its consequences. The defense of Balaclava, orchestrated by Sir Colin Campbell, necessitates a final, scholarly reflection on whether this vital tactical triumph was ultimately worth the profound moral cost and the complex, often corrosive, enduring political legacy it bequeathed to the British Empire. The immediate tactical victory was undeniable. The port was saved, the siege continued, and the entire Allied position was preserved through the winter. This success, however, was immediately tainted by the moral compromise of the subsequent official narrative. The most unsettling cost of the stand was the deliberate suppression of truth. Campbell's success was a living, demonstrable repudiation of the aristocratic-led system that dominated the British Army. His victory dictated an urgent, moral imperative for reform, the immediate abolition of the purchase system, the prioritization of professional training, and the elevation of competence over social class. The political establishment, however, chose to ignore this imperative. They sacrificed the truth to preserve their own status, allowing the romanticized tragedy of the Light Brigade to eclipse Campbell's tactical brilliance. The moral cost, therefore, was paid by the thousands of British soldiers who, in subsequent campaigns, would continue to suffer under incompetent commanders and antiquated doctrine, simply because the men in Whitehall refused to acknowledge the fundamental lessons learned in the South Valley. The ultimate moral indictment of the battle lies not with the soldiers who fought, but with the politicians who manipulated the narrative afterward. The enduring political legacy. The political legacy of Sir Colin Campbell is paradoxical. In the short term, his success was a source of great difficulty for the government, forcing them to reluctantly acknowledge the effectiveness of a general they disliked. His methods, the emphasis on the professional soldier and the rifle's capabilities, became the unwelcome foundations of later reforms. The enduring legacy is twofold. The validation of professionalism. Balaclava provided the definitive, empirical evidence required by later reformers to challenge the purchase system. Campbell's thin red line became an unassailable symbol for those arguing that meritocracy must replace aristocracy in the military. It took 2 decades and further systemic failures, notably the Cardwell reforms of the 1870s, but Campbell's doctrine ultimately prevailed, shaping the professional standards of the late Victorian and Edwardian armies. The triumph of the narrative. Despite the doctrinal victory, the overriding political success belonged to the narrative of heroic failure. The charge of the Light Brigade permanently embedded a form of moral romanticism into the British psyche regarding war, a focus on courage and sacrifice that often excused systemic failure. Campbell's quiet, effective win could never compete with the political utility of a glorious tragedy. This legacy ensured that while the army eventually adopted Campbell's doctrine, the nation remembered the battle primarily through the lens of Tennyson's poetry, delaying a truthful, complete reckoning with the administrative corruption that had necessitated Campbell's genius. In conclusion, Campbell's stand was a triumph of the will and an undeniable military masterpiece. It saved the Allied effort. Yet, the moral cost was the active political suppression of the truth it revealed, a suppression that perpetuated incompetence across the British military for decades. The victory was worth the human sacrifice made by the 93rd, whose casualties were mercifully light, but the victory was nearly rendered meaningless by the cynical political maneuvers that followed. The unsettling reckoning is the scholarly conclusion that, at Balaclava, tactical genius defeated Russian cavalry, but political treachery defeated military reform. The war was won, but the necessary moral lesson was deliberately buried.